The air in the makeshift field hospital tasted of iron, antiseptic, and dust. For Annelise Schmidt, it was the perfume of her world. August 1944 had bled into a nightmare of constant retreat. The grand ambitions of the Reich had dissolved into the mud and chaos of the Normandy countryside. Here, in a commandeered French barn near the town of Falaise, all that remained was the desperate struggle to hold back death, one soldier at a time. The distant percussive thunder of Allied artillery was the rhythm of their lives, a sound that crept closer with every passing hour. "More pressure on that artery, Annelise." Dr. Richter's voice was a frayed cord, stretched to its breaking point. Annelise pressed down harder on the bloody wad of gauze covering a young Panzer grenadier's leg. The boy couldn't have been more than 17. His eyes were wide with a terror that transcended pain. "It's not stopping," she murmured, her own voice barely a whisper. Her hands, stained brown with dried blood and iodine, trembled slightly. Supplies were almost gone. The last of the morphine had been used that morning. The bandages were rewashed and reused, rough and gray against torn flesh. Even the soap they used to scrub their hands between patients was a harsh, gritty block of ersatz material, filled with sand and clay that chafed their skin raw. Her friend Greta, a nurse whose weary cynicism was a form of armor, caught her eye from across the barn. "They've broken through at Trun," Greta mouthed silently, her face a mask of grim resignation. The Falaise pocket was closing. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's Allied forces were squeezing them from all sides, a vast metal python crushing the life out of the German 7th Army. Annelise felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. They were trapped. The end came not with a bang, but with a sudden, terrifying silence. The roar of a nearby machine gun stuttered and died. The shouting outside changed in tone and language. The barn door creaked open, and the bright, unforgiving sunlight framed the silhouettes of men in unfamiliar helmets. They were Americans. A young lieutenant with dirt on his face and exhaustion in his eyes swept his rifle across the room, his gaze lingering on the rows of wounded Germans. For a moment, no one moved. There was only the sound of the wind rattling a loose roof tile and the shallow, ragged breathing of the dying. Then, in broken German, the American officer spoke. "The fighting is over for you. You are prisoners of war." Annelise looked down at her blood-soaked hands, the war ending for her not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet, helpless surrender of a barn full of broken men. Of course. Here's the second part of the story. The days that followed their capture blurred into a montage of exhaustion and dislocation. Annelise and Greta, along with a handful of other female nurses and auxiliaries, were separated from the main body of male prisoners and herded onto trucks. They rumbled through the devastated French countryside, past the blackened husks of panzers and the shallow, hastily dug graves marked by upturned rifles. French civilians watched them pass from the doorways of their shattered homes, their faces a mixture of cold fury and weary pity. "Look at them," Greta muttered, her voice rough as they passed a group of jeering villagers. "They act as if we personally burned their fields. We were only trying to keep our own boys from dying in them." Annelise remained silent, clutching the small satchel that held her only remaining possessions. A comb, a photo of her family in Berlin, and a few blank pages torn from a medical text. The Americans were professional, almost detached. They provided rations, tinned meat and hard biscuits that tasted bland but filled their empty stomachs, and water from canvas bags that smelled of chlorine. There was no brutality, only an overwhelming impersonal efficiency. They were no longer people. They were logistical problems to be managed. Their destination was the port of Cherbourg, recently captured and now a sprawling hub for the Allied war machine. The sight that greeted them was staggering. The harbor, choked with vessels of every size, was a forest of cranes and masts. On the quays, tens of thousands of German soldiers were corralled in vast, wire-fenced enclosures, a sea of defeated field gray uniforms. The scale of the disaster was absolute. The Wehrmacht in France had not just been beaten, it had been swallowed whole. From the diary of Annelise Schmidt, August 28, 1944. Somewhere near Cherbourg. I have a small pencil and a few pages torn from a medical manual. I must write, or I will lose myself. They call us prisoners of war. It is a strange, hollow sound. We are cargo now, items on a list to be processed and shipped. Where? No one will say. Some whisper England, others, America. America. It sounds like a fairy tale, a place on the other side of the world. Greta scoffs. She says we will be lucky if we are not put to work in a mine. I look at the thousands of boys here, their faces blank with shock, and I'm not so sure what luck looks like anymore. Finally, their turn came. They were marched up the steel gangplank of a colossal vessel, a Liberty ship, one of the American guards said. Its hull was painted a dull, lifeless gray, the color of the sea and the sky. The women were led deep into the ship, down narrow ladders into a cramped hold that smelled of diesel fuel, sweat, and brine. The space was filled with tiered bunks, and the air was thick and humid. A single, bare bulb cast long, dancing shadows. The heavy steel door clanged shut, plunging them into semi-darkness. A low vibration began to thrum through the floor, and Annelise felt the great ship shudder as its engines came to life. They were moving. Through a small, salt-stained porthole, she watched the coast of France, her entire world, until now, recede and vanish into the gray mist of the Atlantic. Of course, here is the third part of the story. The Atlantic crossing was a 2-week eternity in a gray metallic stomach. The constant thrum of the engines and the lurch of the hull became the only reality. Seasickness swept through the hold, a misery that bonded the women in a shared, silent suffering. Annelise spent hours staring through the porthole, watching the endless, indifferent waves, feeling impossibly small and far from everything she had ever known. Home was no longer a place on a map, but a memory that grew fainter with every nautical mile. Then, one morning, a cry went up. Land! The women crowded the portholes. Through the haze, a hazy silhouette sharpened into a fantastic skyline of impossibly tall buildings, their windows glinting in the morning sun. A colossal green statue of a robed woman holding a torch stood guard at the entrance to the harbor. New York. It was a city untouched by war. There were no columns of smoke, no skeletal remains of bombed-out buildings, no rubble-strewn streets. My God, Annelise breathed, her face pressed to the cool glass. It's all whole. Greta shouldered her way to the porthole, her expression a familiar mask of disbelief. A nation of shopkeepers, she scoffed, but there was no real venom in her voice. They talk of President Roosevelt and his war effort, but they have never heard an air raid siren. What do they know of war? On the dock, they were herded into lines by soldiers who looked impossibly young and well-fed. One of them, a corporal with a Midwestern accent and a name tag that read Riley, watched them with a kind of nervous curiosity. Corporal John Riley, barely 20 years old, had grown up on a farm in Nebraska. To him, these German women were not the fanatical Valkyries of propaganda posters, but pale, tired figures who huddled together and spoke in hushed, guttural tones. His job was simple: get them processed and onto the train west. The first stop was a delousing station, a humiliating but swift process. Then they were marched into a clean, concrete building that echoed with the hiss of plumbing. A female officer, stern but not unkind, handed each of them a plain cotton shift and a rough towel, and a bar of soap. Annelise stared at the object in her palm. It was perfectly rectangular, a creamy, uniform white. It was smooth, almost silky to the touch, and stamped with the name Ivory. Hesitantly, she lifted it to her nose. The scent was clean, light, and faintly floral. It was a smell from another lifetime, a vision of the gritty, gray ersatz soap of the field hospital, filled with sand that scratched your skin raw, flashed in her mind. She stepped under a stream of steaming hot water, a luxury she hadn't felt in years. When she worked the American soap in her hands, it didn't crumble. Instead, it exploded into a thick, luxurious lather, a cloud of fragrant foam that felt softer than silk. As she washed away the grime of the battlefield, the filth of the transport ship, and the dust of a fallen empire, tears began to stream down her face, mixing with the water and the suds. It wasn't relief. It was a profound, soul-crushing revelation. This item, this simple, disposable luxury given freely to a captured enemy, spoke more about American power than any tank or bomber. If they had soap like this to waste on their prisoners, what hope had Germany ever had? It wasn't a gun or a general that finally made her understand the totality of their defeat. It was a simple bar of white soap. Of course, here's the fourth part of the story. The train journey west was a silent lesson in American immensity. For days, the landscape unspooled outside their window, a reel of impossible bounty. They crossed sprawling cities that hummed with industry, their skies clear of flak and smoke. They passed through endless fields of corn standing tall and green, past sturdy farmhouses with painted barns and herds of fat cattle. It was a nation at work, not at war. Every mile driven deeper into the continent was another turn of the key in the lock of their defeat. This was the arsenal of democracy President Roosevelt spoke of, not just a factory, but an entire continent of inexhaustible resource. Their final destination was a place of vast, empty sky and flat earth, a POW camp near Kearney, Nebraska. The name felt alien on Annelise's tongue. The camp itself was another shock. Instead of the grim, muddy enclosures she had imagined, she saw orderly rows of clean wooden barracks surrounded by a high-wire fence. It looked less like a prison and more like a Spartan workers' village. Guards, including a now familiar Corporal Riley, patrolled the perimeter, but their demeanor was relaxed, almost bored. Inside, the routine was monotonous but humane. The food was simple but plentiful. They were served white bread, potatoes, vegetables, and sometimes meat. They drank fresh milk, a staggering luxury that made some of the women weep. "This is a trick," Greta insisted one evening, poking at a piece of beef on her plate. She kept her voice low, but it was sharp with contempt. "A psychological weapon. They fatten us up like geese for slaughter, trying to make us forget who we are. They want us to see their system as superior." "Isn't it?" Annelise replied quietly, not looking up from her plate. The question hung in the air between them. Greta glared at her, a flash of the old, defiant fire in her eyes. "You sound defeated, Annelise. Have you forgotten our soldiers who starved in Stalingrad? Have you forgotten our bombed cities? This comfort is an insult to their memory." "No," Annelise said, her voice trembling slightly. "I haven't forgotten. That is why I see this. It is not an insult, Greta. It is the reason. We thought the war was about willpower and spirit. They knew it was about this." She gestured with her fork at the food, the clean hall, the electric lights overhead. It was about bread and steel, about milk and soap. We never stood a chance. From the diary of Annelise Schmidt, September 15, 1944. Camp Kearney, Nebraska. "The sky here is enormous. It makes you feel very small. At night, there are no searchlights, no tracers, only stars. The silence is the loudest thing I have ever heard. Greta calls this a golden cage, and she is right. The fence is real. We are prisoners. But the cage is comfortable, and that is its own kind of torture. It forces you to think. Back home there was no time to think, only to act, to patch a wound, to run for shelter, to survive until the next sunrise. Here there is nothing but time. Time to reflect on how a nation could have so much of everything, while we had nothing left but slogans. One afternoon, a notice was posted. The camp was seeking volunteers to help with the local harvest. Farmers in the area were short on manpower, and under the terms of the Geneva Convention, prisoners could work for a small wage. Greta scoffed at the idea of helping the enemy, but Annelise, desperate for a change of scenery, for a purpose beyond sitting and waiting, wrote her name on the list. She wanted to see the country outside the wire. She wanted to understand the source of the bread, the milk, and the soap. Of course, here is the fifth and final part of the story. The work was hard, honest toil under the vast Nebraska sun. Annelise, along with a dozen other women, was driven each morning to a farm several miles from the camp. They spent their days harvesting sugar beets, their hands digging into the rich, dark soil. The farmer was an old man named Jacobson, whose 2 sons were fighting somewhere in the Pacific. He rarely spoke, directing them with slow gestures, his eyes holding a distant sadness that Annelise understood completely. His wife would bring them cool water in glass jars and sandwiches made with thick slices of white bread and meat. They didn't treat the prisoners with contempt, but with a quiet, weary civility. Corporal Riley often supervised their detail. He would stand guard by the truck, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder, watching them work. He saw them not as enemies, but as women far from home, just as his own brothers were. One sweltering afternoon, as Annelise paused to wipe sweat from her brow with the back of a dirt-caked hand, he walked over and offered her a bright red apple from his own lunch pail. "Beta," he said, using one of the few German words he knew. Annelise hesitated, then took it. The skin was smooth and cool. "Danke," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the dust. It was a small gesture, insignificant in the grand scale of the war, yet it felt monumental. It was a moment of shared humanity in a world that had tried to erase it. Holding the apple, standing in the middle of a field that stretched to the horizon, everything clicked into place for Annelise. The soap, the milk, the bread, this apple, it all came from the same source, this endless, fertile, peaceful land. The strength of America wasn't just in its factories and armies, but here, in the quiet, unassuming abundance of its soil. The Nazi promise of Lebensraum, living space conquered through blood, was a violent fantasy. America didn't need to conquer living space. It already was living space. The war had been lost not in the rubble of Berlin or the snows of Stalingrad, but here in a Nebraskan beet field, under a sky free of bombers. From the diary of Annelise Schmidt, October 30th, 1944. I worked in the earth today, the same earth that covers the world, but here it feels different. It does not smell of death, it smells of life. Greta does not understand. She still speaks of honor and defiance, but our defiance was built on a lie. Our leaders told us we were a superior people, yet they gave us sand-filled soap and sent our children to die for a scrap of frozen mud. The Americans, who we were told were decadent and weak, have a strength so vast they cannot even comprehend it themselves. The war will end soon. We hear whispers of Allied advances on all fronts. I will go home one day, back to Germany. What I will find there, I do not know. Rubble, I imagine. But this I know for certain. When we rebuild, it cannot be with the old lies. It must be with something real, something as simple and as powerful as a bar of white soap and a handful of rich, dark earth.